At a crowded Boston train station, a fragile girl sat at a piano, and what happened next left everyone speechless. Like this video, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us share more powerful stories. Boston's South Station was alive with its usual storm of noise and movement. The air carried the overlapping sounds of rolling suitcases, hissing brakes, echoing announcements, and hurried footsteps crossing the marble floor. Commuters rushed with coffee cups, professionals tapped furiously at glowing phone screens, children tugged at their parents' hands, and no one seemed to notice the small figure standing near the grand piano in the center of the concourse. The piano itself was gleaming, polished under the harsh station lights, and often drew casual performers who entertained travelers between departures. But this afternoon it drew the eyes of a different figure, thin, fragile, and almost ghostly in presence. Her name was Emma Parker. She was 13 years old, but illness had aged her in ways no child should experience. Her hoodie hung loosely from her bony shoulders, 2 sizes too big, the fabric worn at the elbows. Her shoes were scuffed and her jeans frayed at the knees. Her skin was pale, her cheeks hollow, and even the casual passerby could see the story her frail frame told. This was a girl carrying far more than childhood should allow. Around her wrist, partly hidden under her sleeve, was a hospital bracelet that had not yet been cut off. Emma's stomach ached with hunger, her body too weak to ignore it. She had come here with a purpose, though the courage to act on it trembled in her chest. Her eyes, wide and uncertain, kept drifting toward the piano. It represented more than music. To her, it was a door, a chance, maybe even the difference between another day of invisibility and one small moment where the world might see her. She moved closer, clutching her hoodie's pocket, her lips trembling as she whispered words almost too soft to hear. "Please, may I play, just for some food?" The request floated into the chaos of the station, quickly swallowed by noise. For a moment, it seemed no one had heard her. But then, a few people glanced over. Young men sipping lattes, a businessman waiting by the departure board, and a security guard leaning against a pillar. Instead of sympathy, there was laughter. One of the young men nudged his friend, whispering something that made both chuckle loudly. The businessman shook his head, muttering, "This isn't a place for games." The guard, John Miller, smirked and crossed his arms, leaning back with the easy confidence of someone entertained at another's expense. Emma felt her chest tighten. Every laugh pressed against her like a stone. She had grown used to the sting of being invisible, but humiliation was harder. Still, the ache of hunger and the pull of music outweighed the fear. She repeated her words louder this time. "Please, I just want to play. Food for music." Some travelers slowed, curious, but no one offered help. A woman shook her head and walked away. The group of young adults laughed again, whispering cruelly, "She can barely stand. What could she possibly play?" Even the guard's smirk widened. Emma's eyes watered, but she refused to let them see her cry. She forced herself to take one shaky step forward, then another, until she reached the piano bench. Each movement was heavy, as if her body was fighting against her will. She lowered herself carefully, her knees trembling under her weight. The polished surface of the piano reflected her pale face back at her. An image of fragility and defiance collided in the same child. The laughter grew behind her, louder now that phones were being lifted. A couple of teenagers pointed their cameras at her, clearly ready to capture a moment of mockery. One woman whispered just loud enough for others to hear, "This should be funny." Emma's fingers hovered above the keys. They shook, not only from weakness, but from fear of failure. She remembered the days before her illness, when she would sit at her family's old upright piano for hours. Her mother would smile and say, "Emma, your hands can make the world stop if only people listen." That memory pressed against her heart now, fragile but fierce, and she clung to it like a lifeline. She closed her eyes. The sounds of laughter and station noise blurred together. All that mattered was the cool surface of the ivory keys beneath her fingertips and the fragile strength still living inside her. The guard shifted on his feet, preparing to send her away. The young adults laughed louder, one of them saying, "She doesn't even know where to start." But Emma inhaled deeply. She was too hungry to give up, too desperate to let go of this chance. She placed her trembling hands on the keys. In that moment, the world seemed to pause, waiting for the sound. The crowd leaned forward, expecting broken notes, expecting her to fail, expecting a joke. Emma, however, thought only of her mother's words, and with every ounce of courage left in her, she pressed down. The next instant would decide everything. The first note did not come timidly. It rose from the piano like a clear bell struck in winter air, a tone so pure it sliced through the station's noise and stilled it. Conversations clipped off mid-sentence. A dropped coffee lid rolled in a slow circle and came to rest against the base of the bench. The departure board continued to clatter through times and platforms, but even its fuss sounded suddenly far away. Emma's hands, thin, almost translucent under the lights, settled more firmly on the keys as if, with that single sound, she had found a footing stronger than legs could give. The second note joined the first with quiet certainty, and then a third, and then a braided thread of melody unfurled into the cavern of South Station. It was not a beginner's hesitant line, nor the showy cascade of a street virtuoso playing to impress. It was a voice, hers, told in tone and weight and breath. It confessed before it dazzled. It asked you to listen before it asked you to cheer. The group of young adults who had laughed first were closest to the piano, their paper cups still steaming. Their laughter didn't so much stop as get pulled away from them, taken by the sound. One of them lowered his phone from a mocking angle to a level hold, recording now as if he had stumbled onto a secret he wasn't sure he had a right to keep. Another reached for his friend's sleeve without looking away from Emma, a small, reflexive gesture that said, "Do you hear this too?" The businessman by the departure board straightened his tie as if good posture might help him understand what he was hearing. A woman with a stroller turned the entire carriage toward the piano, the toddler inside going quiet as if story time had arrived. Children, always alert to the invisible weather of a room, stopped tugging and fidgeting and simply watched. Somewhere behind them a luggage wheel squeaked a gentle, stubborn rhythm, and then the suitcase's owner lifted it to spare the moment the insult of friction. John Miller, the security guard with the easy smirk and crossed arms, felt his posture come undone. He didn't move toward the piano, not yet, but his weight shifted forward on the balls of his feet, the way it did when a train braked hard or a crowd pressed suddenly. The smirk left without asking permission, replaced by a stunned line at the mouth he hadn't worn since he was a boy, and a radio in his mother's kitchen made a Motown chorus sound like a door opening. Emma did not look up. She didn't search the faces to measure the damage or the favor. She was inside the keybed, inside the felt and wire and wood. The melody she'd begun widened into phrases that leaned into sorrow and then caught themselves before falling. There was pain there, unhidden, unvarnished, but it never turned to pleading. It admitted what it had lost, and then insisted on what it could still be. When the left hand entered, soft, a heartbeat at first, the right hand's line found a spine to rest against, and the piece began to live as something more than memory. Someone near the front whispered, "Oh my God," and it wasn't entertainment anymore, it was encounter. Another voice said, "Listen to her. not as a command, but as a benediction. And people did. What the phone cameras caught was simple. A girl in a hoodie 2 sizes too big, slight as a reed, bending over a piano bench as if the instrument were a friend she was both greeting and leaning on. What the microphones could not catch was the part that traveled along the surface of the notes, the breath between them, the intention that paced the rise and fall. She was not trying to be beautiful. She was trying to be true, and in the trying, the beauty took care of itself. The young man who had joked, "She can barely stand," now found his eyes wet without remembering the moment tears arrived. He blinked and let them stay. A woman who had been scrolling through news about markets and mergers forgot, for once, to be informed, and simply stood with her hand over her mouth. A teenage girl lowered her own earbuds, slid them into her pocket, and instead of filming, reached for the sleeve of the person next to her and squeezed. The station's acoustics favored honesty. The ceiling's high curve gathered the sound and gave it back fuller, but not dressed up. The notes lifted into the air and came down again like birds that trusted their return. Emma's face carried concentration rather than strain. When her arms trembled, the tremor bent itself into the line of the music, turning weakness into vibrato, fatigue into color. She had not come to conquer the room, but to survive it, and somehow that aim reached further and settled deeper than bravado could have. A little boy on his father's shoulders began to clap in the middle of a phrase, 2 brave, off-time claps, and his father hushed him gently with a laugh that was half sob. The boy's hands dropped to his father's forehead and rested there, small palms warm against skin, while his eyes, large, unblinking, stayed on the girl at the piano. Across the way, a woman with silver hair nodded to the pulse of the left hand, counting not in numbers, but in memories she couldn't have named aloud. John Miller took 1 step closer, not an authoritative step, not the kind that says, "Move along," but the kind that says, "I need to be nearer to see this right." He found himself between the piano and a pillar and realized, with a flicker of embarrassment, that he had blocked no one's view. People had already formed a ring, respectful without being ceremonious, the way crowds do when a street light goes out and the stars remember their lines. Emma's right hand climbed, the left hand answered. The climactic rise did not arrive as a shout, but as a widening, like a window opening farther than you realized it could. The melody gathered itself from a thread into a ribbon, from a ribbon into something you could spread over a small grief to keep it warm. Notes the color of winter sunlight landed, and the faces nearest the keyboard showed the strange relief of hurt recognized and not dismissed. "Who taught her?" someone asked, softly, like a prayer. It didn't matter. The question was already out of date. Whatever had taught her, lessons, sorrow, hunger, a mother's sentence about stopping the world, had been poured through the sieve of this moment and come out as presence. Emma's breathing quickened. A bead of sweat found the curve of her temple and slid along the pale line of her cheek. She felt the wobble in her forearms like a delayed echo, but the rhythm underneath refused panic. Her left thumb, steady as a nurse's pulse count, held the floor while her right hand reached for a shape of hope that wouldn't sound cheap when it arrived. She avoided easy triumph the way a good storyteller avoids easy endings. When the bright chord was due, she shaded it, let it earn itself, and only then allowed it to lift. Phones were everywhere now, but the recording felt secondary, like writing down the words after you've already believed them. A teenage boy who had started filming as a joke found himself lowering his camera, the red dot still blinking, because somehow looking without the screen felt more honest. The businessman's shoulders softened. He took off his glasses, not to polish them but to give them a break from being a shield. At the outer edge of the ring, a figure appeared who did not need to push to make space. The space made itself the way water parted around a stone with history. He was older, tall despite the cane, coat hanging true from squared shoulders rather than draped for effect. His hair, silver and neatly combed back, caught the station lights and gave them back as a muted sheen. Richard Harper did not announce himself. He did not need to. To some, he would be a stranger. To others, a face from programs and posters, a name that had appeared in reviews and broadcasts for decades. To Emma, whose eyes were still closed, he was, like the rest of the crowd, not yet anyone. Harper's gaze moved not to Emma's face, but to her wrists, her knuckles, the economy of her motion. He listened to the weight she gave the inner voices, the way she let the line breathe without sagging, the way she allowed imperfection to be expressive rather than careless. A conductor's mind takes inventories in silence, intonation, time, phrasing, intent. But beyond the list, something less measurable pressed against him. He had spent a lifetime teaching orchestras to speak as one. Here was a single child speaking for more than herself, and doing so with the unselfconscious truth he had sometimes begged professionals to remember. He eased closer by inches. No one minded. The room, if you could call a station that, had become a hall, and halls know how to welcome listeners who mean it. When Harper finally stopped, he was near enough to see the faint imprint of a hospital band around Emma's wrist, the way the plastic had left a thin pale line even when hidden beneath her sleeve. His jaw tightened, and then he breathed out, letting judgment travel back into consideration. The music shifted. Emma brought the volume down, not with a sudden drop, but with a careful gathering, like pulling a shawl more snugly around shoulders. The main theme returned, quieter, and new harmonies appeared beneath it. The kind you don't notice until they have already changed your thinking. The crowd leaned as if the sound had weight and leaning would help them share it. The departure board clacked out on time in cheerful rows that now felt beside the point. A little girl in a pink jacket began to sway, small arcs like a metronome set to human tempo. Her mother didn't stop her. An older man, stiff with the long aches that come to those who have spent years lifting what families require, took his hands out of his coat pockets and pressed them together as if in prayer, though he would not have called it that. John Miller looked down at his radio, caught himself as if he'd been about to silence it, and then simply moved the volume dial a notch lower. He did not call for backup. He did not call for management. He watched and listened and realized the station had become safer, somehow, not because the rules were firmer, but because people were remembering themselves. Emma's hands quivered more obviously now. The quiver did not steal control. It supplied tenderness. Where another player might have covered fatigue with speed, she did the opposite, letting the phrase lengthen by a heartbeat, then arriving at the cadence with a grace that made the timing feel inevitable. She could have ended there, on a resolution that would have satisfied, but the music told her there was one more truth to speak. She found it, not grand, not flashy, a quiet turn, a small lift, a final chord held just long enough to honor what had been asked of her and what she had given. Silence followed, but it was not empty. It had shape. It rang. For a breath, the entire station shared that shape as if it were a bowl passed hand to hand, everyone careful not to spill. A single clap landed too soon and then halted embarrassed. The crowd laughed softly, not at the clapper but with him, because awe is awkward before it is communal. Then the applause rose, first in pockets, then in waves, not thunderous yet, because no one wanted to crush what they had just received. It was the kind of applause that holds room for tears. Emma didn't stand. She stayed seated, head bowed, chest lifting and falling with effort. The hoodie that had seemed too big now looked like a shelter she could not quite enter. She swallowed and set her hands in her lap to still them. When she finally lifted her face, it was to the sight of strangers who had become audience who had become witnesses. John Miller found himself clapping. It felt strange in uniform, but less strange than not clapping would have. He met the eyes of a woman across from him who had seen him smirk earlier. She smiled at him not with triumph but with relief, and he nodded, an apology too wordless to be formal, but understood. Richard Harper's hands did not clap at first. He let the noise crest and settle, studying the lines of strain along Emma's forearms, the way she guarded her breathing, the raw honesty with which she had offered herself to a space that had offered her no kindness to begin with. Then, quietly, he raised his cane a few inches and tapped it once against the floor, a conductor's private ovation, and joined the applause with open palms. The ring of people reformed, gentler now, leaving air between themselves and the bench. Some lowered their phones. A few did not, but their filming had lost the edge of spectacle and found the angle of reverence. Someone placed a granola bar on the piano lid and stepped back quickly, not demanding thanks, just hoping she might see it when she needed it. A paper bag followed, sandwich, apple, a note folded small. No one announced themselves as the giver. The offerings gathered like small boats at the edge of a dock, moored with string and hope. Emma closed her eyes again, not to play, but to steady. She inhaled, tasting the breath of a room that, moments before, had not wanted her. When she opened them, the first gaze she met was Harper's. Clear, assessing, kind without softness. He gave the smallest of nods, the sort that says, "I heard you." I heard all of it. She did not know who he was. She knew only that the nod did not demand anything back. The station remembered itself slowly, announcements returning, rolling bags daring to squeak again, the ordinary tide reversing, but it did so with a new caution, as if the sound in the marble had trained it to use indoor voices. Parents leaned to their children and whispered what they had just felt. Teenagers compared the shaky footage they had caught and then fell quiet, understanding that pixels could not hold it. The businessman checked the time and did not rush. He would make the next train. Richard Harper took a half step forward, careful not to break the small perimeter of respect around the bench. He glanced once at John Miller, who, without knowing why, shifted aside to grant him the nearest line of sight. Harper's mouth formed a line that could be sternness or tenderness depending on where you stood. He looked at Emma's hands again, the way she held them still to keep the trembling from showing, and at the hospital band's pale mark. Something like recognition crossed his face. Not recognition of a person, but of a moment he had seen twice in a long life, when someone who had no position spoke with authority anyway, because the truth, when told, confers it. The applause had fallen to a hush, and then into silence again. In that quiet, the room, this unlikely hall, waited to see what would happen next. No declarations had been made, no names had been spoken aloud, only the music had spoken, and it had been enough to change the weather. Emma, exhausted and steady at once, let her fingers fall once to her lap, then to the keys, not to play but to feel their coolness like a promise. The granola bar and the paper bag sat at the edge of her vision. She did not reach for them yet. A thank you formed and dissolved on her lips, unnecessary and true. And just beyond the circle, cane planted, shoulders square, eyes bright with the glint of something decided, Richard Harper stood ready, listening still, but no longer merely a listener. To be continued. Emma's last notes lingered in the air like a fragile thread, trembling but unbroken. For a moment, it felt as though the entire station had forgotten to breathe. Then, almost as one, The crowd exhaled, a collective sigh of awe and disbelief. The circle of people around her thickened. Strangers pressed closer, not to mock, but to witness. Mothers held their children tighter, fathers wiped their eyes discreetly, and the teenagers who had laughed earlier shifted uncomfortably, ashamed of their own cruelty. Phones that had been raised to capture her failure were now recording something no one wanted to forget. Emma's arms shook with fatigue, her chest heaving as she tried to steady her breath, but she kept her eyes lowered, as if afraid to look at the crowd that only minutes before had ridiculed her. The granola bar and sandwich someone had left on the piano were still untouched. She had not come here to beg for pity. She had come to prove that she still had something no illness could take away. Among the ring of faces, Richard Harper stood closest now, his cane planted firmly on the marble floor. His silver hair glistened beneath the harsh lights, and his sharp eyes remained fixed on Emma's hands. He did not clap like the others. Instead, he studied her the way a craftsman studies a rare artifact, knowing it was fragile but recognizing its worth at first glance. The melody had left him shaken. Richard had spent his life conducting orchestras, traveling the world, and hearing countless prodigies. Yet there was something in Emma's playing that pierced deeper than technique. It was raw, unpolished truth, the kind of truth that could not be taught. His gaze softened, and for the first time in years, he felt a sting of tears in his own eyes. The applause swelled again, thunderous now, echoing off the high ceiling. But even through the noise, another presence began to push forward. The crowd parted instinctively, and into the open space stepped a woman whose elegance commanded attention. Her heels clicked softly against the marble as she approached, her diamond necklace catching the light of the station. Her hair was perfectly styled, her posture radiated authority, and even before she spoke, whispers rippled through the audience. Margaret Hayes. Some recognized her instantly, the renowned talent scout who had discovered some of the most celebrated pianists of the decade. Others only knew her face from magazines and concert programs, but all understood one thing. This was not an ordinary spectator. Margaret's eyes locked on Emma with a mixture of disbelief and reverence. She had heard countless performances in her life, but never something like this. What this frail child had just delivered in a crowded train station was not merely music. It was a miracle. The applause slowly died down as Margaret stepped closer to the piano. Her voice, calm but trembling with emotion, carried clearly over the hush. "Young lady," she said, her words deliberate, strong, "that was the most beautiful piece I've ever heard in my life." Gasps swept through the crowd. Emma's lips parted, but no words came. Her eyes widened, stunned, as if she wasn't sure whether to believe what she had just heard. For years, she had been told she was too weak, too small, too insignificant. And now, standing before her, was a woman who held the power to change lives, telling her she was extraordinary. Margaret stepped closer, her gaze never leaving Emma's face. "What is your name?" she asked gently. Emma swallowed hard, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Emma Parker." The name, fragile as it was, carried through the station like a chord struck in unison. The crowd murmured it, repeating it to each other as if engraving it into memory. Margaret placed a hand over her heart. "Emma Parker," she repeated, her voice filled with awe. "The world needs to hear you play. Not just today. Not just here. Everyone." Applause erupted again, louder, more unified than before. People began chanting her name. "Emma! Emma!" filling the station with a sound that made Emma's vision blur with tears. Margaret reached into her purse, pulled out a sleek business card, and laid it gently on the piano lid, as though placing a sacred promise. "Tomorrow," she said firmly, "you will come to my office. I will not let your gift be lost to the streets." Emma's breath caught in her chest. Her heart pounded. Could this be real? Just hours ago, she had begged for food and been laughed at. And now, strangers were chanting her name, and a woman of power was promising her a future. Her trembling hand hovered over the keys once more, but she could not play. The tears finally broke free, sliding down her cheeks. She bowed her head, overwhelmed, as the crowd roared around her. And in that moment, under the blinding lights of the station, Emma Parker realized her life was no longer the same. The roar of applause still echoed in Emma's ears long after the crowd began to disperse. She sat frozen on the piano bench, her hands trembling in her lap, staring at the sleek business card that lay across the polished wood. The name Margaret Hayes was embossed in gold letters, the kind of card that belonged in the pockets of powerful people, not in the hands of a starving 13-year-old. When she finally stood, her knees nearly buckled. A kind stranger pressed a sandwich into her palm. Another placed a bottle of water at her side. She managed a weak smile of thanks, but her voice was gone. She clutched the card to her chest as if it were the only thing holding her upright. For the first time in years, hunger was not the sharpest ache in her body. It was hope, fierce and blinding, that now filled her chest. That night, Emma returned to the shelter where she often slept. The blanket was thin, the air stale, and the cracked ceiling above her head looked the same as always. But Emma was not the same. She lay awake, her eyes wide, her fingers brushing over the edges of the card again and again. The echo of her name. Emma Parker. Emma Parker still rang in her memory louder than the chants of cruelty she had grown used to. For hours she replayed the moment, Margaret stepping forward, her voice steady, her promise undeniable. Emma whispered the words to herself in the dark. The world needs to hear you. It felt like a dream, one she was terrified to wake from, but the card in her hand was real. And so was tomorrow. At dawn, she rose, exhausted but restless, and walked through the streets of Boston. Her clothes were still torn, her shoes still broken at the seams, but inside her chest was a flame she had never felt before. Each step carried her closer to a future she had never dared imagine. When she reached the towering glass building with Margaret Hayes's name etched into the stone, Emma froze at the entrance. The doors gleamed like mirrors, reflecting back her frail body, her oversized hoodie, her hollow cheeks. She looked out of place, like a shadow that had wandered where it did not belong. For a moment, she thought of turning back, of convincing herself it had all been a trick. Her hands shook as she reached for the handle. But before she could retreat, the door opened from inside. Standing there, radiant in a tailored suit, was Margaret herself. Her heels clicked confidently against the floor as she stepped forward, her arms opening wide. Her voice, warm and assured, carried across the lobby. "Emma Parker, I've been waiting for you." Emma's throat tightened. The woman who had the power to decide futures was speaking her name like it mattered. She nodded weakly, stepping inside as though crossing into another world. The receptionist at the desk, polished and poised, looked surprised to see the frail girl standing in such a place. But Margaret's presence silenced all questions. She led Emma toward the elevators, her hand gently resting on the girl's shoulder, guiding her with the care of someone who had already made a decision. Upstairs, the doors opened to a studio unlike anything Emma had ever seen. The walls were lined with gleaming instruments, microphones stood ready, and sound engineers adjusted controls behind glass windows. The room hummed with quiet anticipation, a place built not for survival, but for creation. The people inside turned when Margaret entered, their eyes following her, every move. And then she spoke, her voice carrying authority that left no room for doubt. "Meet Emma Parker," she announced, "the girl who will soon take the world by storm." The words seemed too big for Emma, too impossible. She blinked, her cheeks flushing as every pair of eyes in the room fixed on her. Some looked skeptical, others intrigued, but all were listening. Margaret gestured to the grand piano in the center of the studio. "Go on," she said softly. "Show them what I already know." Emma's legs wobbled as she walked toward it. The instrument seemed larger than life, its polished surface gleaming under the studio lights. She sat down, her breath shallow, her fingers hovering above the keys. For a heartbeat, she hesitated, hearing the echoes of laughter from the station, the voices that had told her she was nothing. Then she remembered the silence that had followed her first note, the way the world had stopped to listen. She closed her eyes and pressed down. The first sound filled the room, pure, haunting, undeniable. Conversation ceased, papers stilled, and even the engineers leaned forward in their chairs. Emma played not for approval, not for contracts or applause, but because she had to, because the music inside her was too heavy to keep locked away. Each note carried the weight of hospital rooms and sleepless nights, of hunger and loneliness, of the pain of being invisible. But woven through it all was something else: defiance, courage, the fragile beauty of a child refusing to disappear. By the time the last note faded, the room was silent. No one moved. Some wiped their eyes quietly, others stared as though they had seen something holy. Margaret's voice broke the silence, a whisper filled with conviction. "This," she said, "is history being written." The silence in the studio after Emma's last note was not the silence of indifference. It was the silence of reverence, the kind that follows a revelation. For several long heartbeats, no one dared move, as though the air itself was still vibrating with her music. Then, slowly, the room erupted, not in casual applause, but in something raw. Producers rose to their feet, clapping with wet eyes. Sound engineers leaned forward against the glass, nodding furiously. Margaret Hayes, standing at the center, pressed her hand over her heart and whispered words no one else could hear. "This is the beginning." Emma sat frozen at the piano, her hands still trembling from the effort. She looked from face to face, seeing astonishment, tears, and admiration where she had expected only doubt. The sudden weight of it all pressed down on her, and for a moment she thought she might cry. But instead, she lowered her gaze, steadying herself. Margaret stepped forward. "Emma Parker," she said, her voice clear and steady, "you have just proven to everyone here what I already knew yesterday. You are not just a pianist, you are a miracle, and I will make sure the world knows your name." With those words, everything began to move quickly. A flurry of hands and papers appeared, contracts drawn up, promises spoken. Emma hardly understood the language on the pages, but Margaret explained softly, her voice full of assurance. "These are the first steps. They will give you the stage you deserve." For the first time in her life, Emma saw adults arguing not about her weakness, not about her illness, but about how to protect her gift. By the evening, headlines had already begun to spread. Clips of her performance at South Station had gone viral overnight. The video, shaky at first, captured the moment when laughter gave way to awe, when a sick girl at a train station became something far greater. Emma Parker, the miracle of Boston Station, blazed across news feeds and television screens. Millions watched, thousands shared, and messages of love poured in from strangers who claimed they had never cried at music until now. Emma walked into a world she had never imagined, one of bright lights and larger stages. She found herself on platforms that had once seemed unreachable, sitting at pianos grander than anything she had seen even in her dreams. Yet, through it all, she remembered. She remembered the cold benches of the shelter, the sting of hunger, the cruel laughter of those who had called her worthless. And because she remembered, she never played for fame. She played for those who were invisible, for every child who had been silenced, for everyone who had been told they were too small, too weak, too broken to matter. Her music was no longer just her story, it became a voice for all who had none. At her first televised concert, the lights rose slowly, washing over the stage and over the thin figure seated at the grand piano. Emma closed her eyes. She felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. Somewhere, in the depths of her memory, her mother's words surfaced again. "Your fingers can make the world stop if only people listen." She pressed the first note. The hall grew still, and as the melody bloomed, carrying with it all the pain, all the hope, all the courage she had fought to keep alive, Emma whispered a promise to herself. She would never stop playing. She would never stop believing, because music had saved her life, and now her music would save others. Her story is only the beginning, and many more are waiting to be told. Don't miss what comes next. Subscribe, hit the bell icon, and share this video. Tell us in the comments what you felt while watching. We read every word.